thank you. I have the honor and the responsibility to close this very inspiring conference. And to do so, I would like to talk to you about the construction of AI as a narrative. So not as applied science, but from the perspective of so-called soft sciences or humanities as a cultural text. To this end, I chose to start with this peculiar illustration. What we are looking at is probably the first known specimen of the attempt to create the appearance of a fully automated artificial intelligence, the so-called mechanical Turk, a chess-playing machine built in the late 18th century to impress a gullible public by creating the impression of playing chess mechanically. After having toured the world and defeated such famous human opponents as Napoleon and Benjamin Franklin, the Turk was revealed to be a hoax. As you can see, the box under the chess player model did not contain a complex mechanism, but a human chess master guiding the model's moves. Interestingly enough, almost 2.5 centuries later, the strange case of fake AI is used by the tech giant Amazon as a model for its crowdsourcing platform Turk, which it actually dubs artificial intelligence. According to Amazon, Turk enables companies to streamline business processes, augment data collection and analysis, and accelerate machine learning development. While technology continues to improve, there are still many things that human beings can do much more effectively than computers. Crowdsourcing is a good way to break down a manual, time-consuming project into smaller, more manageable tasks. To achieve such effective results, Amazon invites companies to access a global on-demand 24/7 workforce and workers to make money in their spare time. In its own way, Amazon's Turk thus creates, just like the fake chess machine of yore, the appearance of rendering results mechanically or virtually without recourse to human labor recognized or recognizable as such. That is, without having to hire and pay a large temporary workforce, which is time-consuming and expensive. The microtasks are performed in the worker's spare time and as such are not compensated as work in the stricter sense. The newspaper The Economist fittingly defines the target group for Turking as people who have computer access and some time to kill. That is, bored housewives and unemployed persons whose activities are not considered as work but rather as pastime and thus do not require remuneration but rather some pocket money of sorts. The real hourly rate at Turk varies depending on the specific tasks, but in average does not exceed $5. The real workers steering the mechanical Turk are thus effectively concealed, in this case not in a box, but behind the appearance of leisure activity. To grasp the implication of the Turk phenomenon, it is enlightening to consult Eric Posner and Glenn Wiles' book, Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. In light of Posner and Wiles' analysis, this pseudo-artificial, non-human automaton that obfuscates the strictly human effort sustaining it, that is hiding the real player in a narrow box, proves to be a fitting metaphor for the workings of today's global digital market. As the authors argue, completing simple virtual tasks for the benefit of tech companies without being paid appropriately or at all is something not only microtasking human intelligence providers do on Turk. It is the daily practice of anyone who uses social media platforms, downloads apps, plays video games, and so on. So basically all of us. According to Posner and Weil, the typical business model under the rules of today's digital market can be summed up as follows. Tech companies offer their users ostensibly free services and in exchange collect the user's data. Accordingly, the authors describe platforms such as Facebook as siren servers or data collectors delivering services that lure users into providing information on which they train AIs using ML. In this constellation, a service of the tech company in the form of entertainment or information is paid for by a return service tacitly extracted from the users, providing their data, with the terms and conditions of this opaque transaction being under the sole control of the tech company, given that the users are left in the dark as to the purpose and value of the data they are providing. It is precisely this economic model, termed techno-feudalism, that allows for a quasi-monopoly position of a small number of tech giants. And as Posner and Weil argue, this economic model can only be transformed in favor of an economically more balanced and socially more just system if the legal basis for accessing user data is radically reconfigured, not through restrictive legislation on data protection, but through a re-evaluation of data as labor. Such a perspective destabilizes the misleading notion of the body of data available to a tech company as the capital owned and deployed by it. Data giants seemingly create value out of nothing, without the use of an extensive labor force, but solely through the individual achievements of a small number of Silicon Valley code wizards who, through their computing skills and entrepreneurial ingenuity, bestow innovative products on a mass of passive consumers. In contrast to this view, Posner and Weil claim that this very mass of ostensibly passive consumers who provide valuable data to the operators of these systems are to be re-evaluated as data workers, that is, active contributors to the creation of the digital products developed from the data material provided by them. Thus, AI products seemingly unilaterally designed and developed by data giants should rather be conceived of as a return on investment of collective resources or as collective intelligence. Or speaking in the terms of the fake chess automaton, the human contribution sustaining artificial intelligence should not be conceived of as an embarrassment to be concealed in a box, but as the engine and the guidance system of digital products. In a way, the Turk construct illustrates the psychoanalytical understanding of the relationship of the human subject and a given signifying system it refers to, a system of meaning and knowledge termed the big other, which can be sustained by a religious belief in a God who guarantees meaning and purpose, but also by a whole range of other, more secular beliefs, such as the inexorable historical necessity, the invisible hand of the market, or, for that matter, the power of algorithms to provide scientifically backed guidance, from business strategies to public governance. Such a reliable reference system provides meaning, guarantees the right course of action, and facilitates tricky decisions. In short, it tells the subject what to do and what to think. It is the big other that constitutes the subject as such by subjecting it to its signifying reign. The subject is spoken by the other. But, and here comes the interesting twist of the matter, even while the subject is produced by its big other, this big other is at the same time the product of the mass of subjects adhering to it, containing exactly the meaning that the subjects put into it. The French philosopher and psychoanalyst Pierre Legendre terms this phenomenon society as text, with the question as to who is actually writing and who is being written always remaining undecided. And this very undecidability between product and producer opens up room for interpretation, the freedom of human subjects to extract new meaning out of the reference text, not just reading it, but interpreting it, confronting their visions and decisions, referring to a big other with the question, is the ostensible message from the big other really what we take it to be? Is this really what God, the market dynamics, and so on, really, is it what God, the market dynamics, and so on really want from us? Or might it rather be something completely different? It is by tackling these questions, by interpreting the message of the big other, that the subject shapes and designs the contents of this big other. So to come back to the image of the mechanical Turk, what it shows us is precisely this. While the non-human big other seemingly automatically generates meaning out of chaos, giving a sense and a direction to the subject which looks up and refers to it, it actually turns out to be generated and steered by that very human subject. As Pierre Legendre further clarifies in this context, the danger to avoid here is relegating the steering function of the subject, that is, the fact that it's the guy in the box who is in charge and not the Turk that magically leads the game. So the danger is relegating the steering function of the subject to oblivion, misconceiving the big other not as the output of human intentions, expectations, etc., but as the expression of an objectively determined truth, not as a narrative to be interpreted, but as a formula to be applied. The absolute other, thus constructed, dictates orders, which are to be heeded unconditionally, without letting any room for interpretation. According to Legendre, however, interpretation is not only a freedom to be enjoyed, but first and foremost a duty to be accomplished. What is required from the subject is hard interpretive work, whereas, strictly speaking, the narrative construction of an absolute other who guarantees meaning without the subject's intervention, a God's will, an economic necessity, an algorithm dictating the only right path to follow, this construction stems from the desire to get rid of the burden of this interpretive work, the desire to be absolved from the burden of responsibility for one's actions and decisions. It is something of a lazy shortcut that seemingly leads us to a divine epiphany or a scientific breakthrough delivering a universal formula, but is actually just an attempt to avoid the effort of reflection, a refusal to think. Economically speaking, it is an attempt to outsource liability, or as Legendre puts it, to abandon oneself, to surrender to something that knows absolutely. That is, to succumb to the fantastic idea that a big other leads the game, that our input is not required and we can just relax and let ourselves be guided. And isn't this something that knows absolutely? Precisely the kind of big other suggested by ideological representations of present-day data analytics. As social scientist Rob Kitchen argues, the purpose of data analytics does not longer consist in using data to check the validity of a given theory, but rather in directly accessing insights generated by the data themselves. Deep data as a new big other speak for itself, automatically generate knowledge and meaning. In short, they render obsolete the human theorists with their imprecise hypotheses. A case in point of such a post-theoretical analytical practice is, according to Kitchen, the software company Ayasti, presenting its services as automated insight discovery and advertising them as follows. Today, big data fails to solve big problems because query-based approaches are flawed. That is, queries are per se postulated as epistemologically detrimental, whereas the problem-solving strategy proposed by Ayasti ostensibly offers the benefit of directly taking the shortcut to the answers without losing time asking unproductive questions. The Ayasti breakthrough consists precisely in discovering answers to questions you didn't know to ask. This is a claim that computer scientist Eric Siegel would certainly endorse for the whole scientific and economic branch of data analytics. In his book, Predictive Analytics, The Power to Predict Who Will Click, Buy, Lie, or Die, the author sums up the methods and objectives of his discipline with a stunning remark. We usually don't know about causation, and we often don't necessarily care. The objective is more to predict than it is to understand the world. It just needs to work. Prediction trumps explanation. Against the backdrop of such a fantastic narrative presenting AI as access to automatic insights, that is, to knowledge without understanding or reading without interpretation, Posner and Weil's concept of data as labor proves to be a constructive critical tool. Through their deconstruction of the idea of a magically self-generating surplus value, uncoupled from any noteworthy labor inputs, the authors also open new perspective on the epistemological surplus value of data analytics. Just as the development of AI through data collection is not simply based on isolated, brilliant inventions, but is rather to be considered as the work output of vast masses of data providers, the employment of AI in data analytics, too, is not just the implementation of a finished product, but a human work process that is a complex set of purposes and actions which necessarily involves multiple possibilities and responsibilities. To further explicate this point, let's take a look at the purpose and the functioning of Ayasti's AI products. These are solutions addressing the hardest to solve financial industry challenges. Most prominently, so-called AML, anti-money laundering, and KYC, know your customers solutions. As I would like to show, these financial compliance tools are an essential part of a fantastically autonomous system, a whole market even, seemingly smoothly running according to its automated internal rules and regulations, but at the same time functioning as a direct expression of a human failure, the refusal to formulate decisions and the endeavor to outsource responsibility perceptible in the AML policy-making processes. Just a short explanation before I go on so you know what I'm talking about. So pursuant to a range of international and state regulations, financial institutions such as banks or investment companies are under the obligation to put in place systems and processes so as to prevent the circulation of dirty money. To facilitate this task, software companies such as IASTI specialize in elaborating time and cost-effective AI solutions, helping banks to comply with their obligations. Based on a thorough knowledge of the bank's customers, due to data on their previous business history, public exposure, criminal records, and so on, AML software scans transactions for suspicious activities, hinting to an illicit provenance or destination of funds, and issues so-called SARs, suspicious activity reports, to be submitted to national FIUs, financial intelligence units, for further processing and potential transmission to law enforcement authorities. Now, IASTI's promise to its customers, that is, financial institutions seeking to satisfy the letter or the spirit, mind you, of government regulations. It is no less than total detection, offering today's most advanced AI and ML technologies to discover all financial risk definitively. To be sure, AML software has been extremely productive lately. In Germany, for instance, the number of SARs transmitted to the FIUs almost tripled in the last couple of years, rising from about 50,000 in 2017 to 140,000 in 2020. And the picture is quite similar in all OECD countries adhering to AML standards. Meanwhile, however, the United Nations assess the amount of money laundered globally as constantly rising, with the amount of illicit funds actually detecting representing only a fraction of a percentage point of the total criminal gains, estimated at about $2 trillion US dollars. Ronald Paul, author of the paper Anti-Money Laundering, the world's least effective policy experiment, comments this development with a remark: letting criminal enterprises retain up to 99% of criminal proceeds, the modern anti-money laundering experiment unwittingly enables, protects, and supports terrorists, drug, human arms and wildlife traffickers, sex and labor exploiters, and corrupt officials, fraudsters, and tax evaders on a global scale. One could argue that the AML system is a perfect example for the practical implementation of Eric Siegel's predictionist convention that the objective is more to predict than it is to understand the world. It just needs to work. The AML system actually does work. It even accounts for a flourishing digital market of its own, with tech companies providing financial institutions with software, generating floods of SARs, providing FIUs flooded with these SARs with software, filtering out high-risk SARs to be treated with priority, and thus, incidentally, also providing criminal entities with clear guidelines for the construction of low-risk profiles undetectable by the system. So one could say that the system works autonomously and automatically and completely independently from the external reality of money laundering, that is, without any noteworthy impact on it. Take the example of another AML software company, Sentinels. The naive layman visiting Sentinels' website will be quite surprised to learn that during their visit, Astronomical sums of money will be laundered within a matter of seconds, notwithstanding Sentinel's expertise in optimizing existing anti-money laundering and transaction monitoring processes. This apparent paradox reflects the everyday reality of money laundering. On the one hand, for instance, OECD's blacklist of so-called uncooperative tax havens not adhering to AML standards has continually diminished and actually completely disappeared in 2009, suggesting that the money laundering phenomenon is under control. On the other hand, revelations from Panama Papers to Pandora Papers keep appearing, suggesting that the money laundering business is still thriving. An interesting anecdote in this context are the recent G7 talks on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where, as reported by The Guardian, the UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said all forms of economic sanctions against Russia were on the table if it made an incursion into Ukraine, and hinted she may be prepared to look again at the UK's laws against money laundering. Now, it might come as something of a surprise that these laws need to be looked into, given the supposedly smoothly working regulative machinery of AML already in place. However, according to sources such as the UK Foreign Affairs Committee, the workings of this machinery never actually prevented London from being a laundromat for Russia's dirty money, a role provoking dismay and frustration amongst US officials who say the fear is that Russian money is so entrenched in London now that the opportunity to use it as leverage against Putin could be lost. So how are we to account for such a discrepancy between the declared purpose of a seemingly working system and its actual outcomes? According to Ronald Paul, the problem does not lie with the AML solutions applied by banks, but with the design of the policies predefining the implicit function of these solutions. The fact that regulators delegated the whole AML issues to banks, thus outsourcing their responsibility and defining money laundering not as a problem of public interest to be fought by law enforcement institutions, but rather as a private business risk of banks, whose interest, of course, is not to fight crime, but to make sure the money they deal with is labeled clean. Looking at the actual output of the AML system, we might as well conclude that it was never designed to actually remove dirty money out of financial institutions, but rather to deliver proof that efforts have been made to clean money from suspicion, as a guarantee for the regulators, policymakers, and representatives of the public interest that the problem has been addressed, as a certificate of sorts of equitable finance that the banks and their software providers are required to produce for the sake of formality. So basically, the purpose of AML is not to fight profit-driven criminal enterprises, but to make sure that the money circulated in our financial institutions is clean, which is an entirely different matter. That the reality of money laundering remains untouched and unimpressed by such measures is not an accident, but part of the design of these measures, and it is in the failure of a perfectly working system to obtain any impact on an external reality that we see the AML system is not only a set of rules and their automatic application, but a narrative, not only rendering explicit outcomes, like a mechanical Turk waging a strategic game against organized crime, but also conveying the hidden intentions of the human regulators sitting in the box, outsourcing the responsibility for crime prevention to financial institutions, while indulging in the tacit belief that it would be a waste to throw away the baby with the bathwater, that once it's been washed clean and made presentable with a compliance certificate, the formerly dirty money could as well be put to productive use. So to sum up, the point is not whether the AI-driven AML system works, but to what end it is used within the larger framework of regulative policies. Accordingly, the focus should be not on the mechanical AML Turk, but on the engine and the guidance system hiding underneath it. the regulator sitting in the box. So to obtain any noteworthy impact on money laundering, what might be required is not more optimizing of automated processes already in place, but rather precisely an effort to understand the world. Generally speaking, when it comes to regulative procedures, the highest stakes might not be in technology and its optimization for the applications of rules and guidelines and standards. The obsession with ever more performant technical tools for their application actually obfuscates the fact that it is the definition of these standards, the articulation of rules, and the formulation of guidelines that is at stake. It's the policies of the human regulators sitting in the box that need to be scrutinized as to their hidden contradictions, not quite honest motives, and convenient, albeit inconsistent beliefs, which need to be revealed, re-evaluated, and revised. To conclude, I would like to call to your attention that we are currently all sitting in a so-called Mobius Strip. According to the website of the Luxembourg Pavilion, it is an infinite form like the circular economy, but also a symbol of openness and dynamism. According to Wikipedia, it is a non-orientable surface. That is, a surface with only one side when embedded in three-dimensional Euclidean space, and only one boundary curve. I actually found a model of it at the Luxembourg shop. So let's take a look at it. There's only one surface actually. And according to Lacanian psychoanalysis, it is the illustration of the fact that the idea of a clear separation between the inside and the outside, the subject and its big other, is an illusion. There is no clear division line between individual and collective, private and public. The subject is always already a social being, while the socio-legal order, that is the collective big other, is permanently being constructed by the subjects living and working within it, and thus carrying the responsibility for its contents. So in order to ensure the openness and dynamism claimed, we need to understand that as part of the society as text, the subject not only reads and follows the big other's rules, but also has the function of the authorial subject writing these rules. And no matter the technical progress we make, the authorial responsibility attached to this function will never be something that can be outsourced. Thank you.